Let's just start off by talking about your channel and when you started it, what was the purpose for it, and I suppose why you got into this field to begin with.
Oh, right. Okay. Let me try and put my thoughts together on that one. So, I had a very classically materialist education, you could say. I also didn't really believe in a lot of the phenomena that I now take quite seriously. I sort of wanted to, but I just thought it was perhaps wishful thinking. It was kind of what I wanted to be true, but I couldn't really see any solid evidence for it. So 2012 rolled around for me, and I had a tantric experience where I was able to push my emotional energy into another person and see them react to that without having arranged or discussed what was going to happen before then. So for me, this is quite overwhelming as evidence. This was someone I had very strong feelings for, and they were lying down on my bed, on their front with their top off, and I was giving them a back massage. And I had this thought pop into my mind. And the thought was something like, why don't you try pushing your feelings into her? And I thought it was funny. I thought that was, oh yeah, okay, right. And I was aware of this sort of reaction to my own idea. And then I thought, well, it's not like you're being judged. It's not like there's anyone sitting around who's going to make fun of you for entertaining this. So I gave it a shot. And I had a very strong reaction from her. I hadn't explained to her beforehand what I was going to do or what was going to happen. I didn't even know it was going to happen. However, for a short period of time, what I was doing was under my conscious volition. It was under my conscious control. It was under what you might call my free will. I could decide when I was going to push this energy into her, and she would react quite strongly. After 3 times of doing this, I did a little bit of a reality check. What's going on here? And I thought I've got to make this as controlled as possible. So I thought, what are the sorts of things that can trigger these sorts of behaviors? So what have we got? Is there any sound that you can make that makes someone make happy woman noises, right? Is there a sound that you can make that makes women do that? I don't know of one, right? I'm just sort of imagining, it sounds absurd, right? It's like, well, somewhere between a C sharp and a B, if you hit exactly the right note. Yeah. So it's a stretch, and I'm going through these things. She can't see me because it doesn't seem credible that there's anything else that could be causing this. But what I do is I make the back massage really boring, so we can't say that it's my incredible back massaging skills. That I'm not saying that skills, I have. Right? Yeah. I'm not saying that. Right. I'm all right. I'm not saying it's that. But I want to exclude it, right? I want to be really rigorous. So I went round in just really boring circles, and then I did the control of the flow of how I was feeling, and sort of like the intention to push that emotion into her, and it was still really tightly, impeccably correlated. I was having my own little freak out of what was going on in reality moment.
What was going on? So it only happened whenever you put your intention on doing it?
Yeah.
That seems to be the only causation you can put together.
Right. My experience of it was you push your feelings into her, she reacts. You stop doing it, she stops. You start doing it, she starts. You stop doing it, she stops.
And of course, you were trying to remove any other factor that may have been influencing it.
After the first 3, because you're playing around at first, and then it starts to feel a bit more serious. And then I did about another 7 goes, something around about that. And then I told her, and she was like, "Oh, that's Tantra." Like, that was a thing. Like, it's like, "Oh, that's perfectly normal, Matthew." "Oh, really? Huh, no one told me." So that was really the experience that I would say was
pivotal.
Yeah, absolutely. But I wasn't comfortable with it, so I didn't really properly tackle it mentally or resolve it against my worldview for at least a couple of years. And then at some point, because of all the things that were going on in my life, I sort of felt I reached a low, right? And when you reach a low, I find myself asking all the questions that I perhaps don't normally want to ask because I feel like I have to face them. And I started to get really, really, really curious because I was sort of thinking, what is this me thing that I can do things that I, prior to that, years before, would have said, no. If this is a real phenomena, we'd be expecting to see it in the scientific textbooks.
Yeah, of course. It'd be all over the news. It'd be in the textbooks.
Right.
Education, as you say.
So you're just being a bit naive if you believe that it's real because the scientists would have found it, right?
Well, they would at least be taking it seriously.
Right. So it's funny because I suppose I found myself on the other end of that, and I'm sort of saying to myself, well, what am I? What am I doing here? And asking all those sorts of questions. So I just went off on a multi-year quest, really, and the answers that I found were so compelling that I had to share them. I mean, it brings a lot of meaning to me to discuss these things and to try and raise these questions and have these conversations. I particularly enjoy having conversations with people who disagree with me as well. And yeah, that's a quick summary of where we've got to.
Great. So your channel is Consciousness Matters. When did you start that project?
Right. So it's gone through a few rebrandings. So it started off probably way back sometime around 2016. And I'm operating on the Jordan Peterson philosophy of if you can't get it right first time round, do it badly, and try and make it better, as if you were writing a book or something. And because of that, I feel that the quality of the content on my channel represents how I feel now, and that there isn't anything on there that's earlier than 2020. So I sort of looked at my early work and thought, we could do that a lot better. And Consciousness Matters is the latest, and I think the stable brand that I'm going to have now. And I say brand because we all, have regular jobs, unless we're really lucky. And, that's just the normal way of talking about it, really. As human beings, we have these ideas and mental associations, and it's idolatry, but it's unavoidable.
Yeah. See, whereas my Seek and I started in 2018, and it hasn't changed at all since then. But never mind, that's we do it differently. I mean, your channel is perfectly kind of in the middle of what a lot of channels are. I mean, you've got on one side, you've got the entertainment only, where people are effectively just arguing for the sake of arguing without really giving much back other than entertainment. Then you've got kind of channels like me, which is education only, not really focused on the dramatics and the production value and all that, but just giving information. Then you're kind of, I like the way you do it because you're smack in the middle.
Thank you.
You've got a bit of both, and I think that's it's a great way of kind of bridging the gap between, I suppose, entertainment and valuable information. And you certainly do need a bit of entertainment in there to grab the audience.
Mm-hmm.
The more appealing it is, the more people are going to come through, and therefore the more people are going to learn about this kind of thing.
Right.
Whereas I suppose with my channel, it's more if you're not already in it, or you're not seriously looking to learn about it, you're not really going to be finding much. You're not going to be able to keep much interest in just talks and discussions.
Well, as we sort of mentioned already, though, in another interview, I really do like the way that you started your channel. I really do like the way that you have managed to explain your personal story quite quickly in a way, but also without compromise. It felt like a really good, solid story and introduction to where you were coming at this from. And I feel that the way that you introduced yourself there makes it really easy to follow everything else that you do.
I appreciate it. I mean, I started off just telling the story, just to kind of introduce myself and what the project was about. And if you're interested, if you want to learn more, keep going. I just did it the way I do it. People say I'm a good interviewer. I've never tried to be an interviewer. I just chat with people.
Well, but I've got some comments on that.
I mean, you have discussions, but you structure yours a lot more than I do. You have kind of questions prepared and areas prepared for where you want to go.
I do.
Which is generally the better way to do it, especially for production value. And it certainly makes for a much more structured, much more followable, I suppose if that's a word, conversation. I mean, the ones you've done with, for example, the skeptic, what did you call it? The discussion with the atheists.
Right, okay, so I've got a couple of different ones there. I've got Timothy Matthew Johnson, who I put myself forward as a minimal theist to see if I could attract a discussion with an atheist. And it's not that I don't believe in a sort of minimal theism, but it's gonna, I think it might throw people off a little bit. I'm being playful with an idea. I'm saying, well, if reality is just one thing and it's fundamentally made of mind, then how could you not call that a form of theism? It's kind of the question that I'm getting at. But I think that when you ask that question to people who are atheists, you get the most interesting answers back. There was another one, though, which was with David Long, who accepted consciousness modifies the world, consciousness influences the world, but he had an emergent position on it. But yeah.
Yeah, and all my point was going to be on there is the way that you structured your atheist one was when you did it as kind of running a script with you and then the atheist, and you put some little bits in between that would keep people's interest. And I think that was a very good way of doing it as well, keeping anonymity for the guy involved.
Oh right, sorry, I know what you mean. That was right, yeah. That's when atheists attack. That's someone who decided that they. Well, I honestly try and make sure that I can reach out. I think one of the things I've learned over getting very emotional about a lot of subjects over the years is that, and it says something about me that I needed to grow up like this, but I did. But I get so emotionally attached to the ideas that especially on the internet, it's very easy to stop seeing the people and the the conscious life experience that people are going through on the other side of things. So I try and very much to connect with people first and understand them when I'm doing interviews now. But if people don't get to the point where they accept an interview, it doesn't mean that there's not something useful to be gained from that. And I was quite shocked, and it really did happen on Atheist Day. I posted something on Facebook as a genuine inquiring message trying to sort of explore a subject, and I got a very angry private message, Facebook message back off this chap. And my attitude just kind of flipped to, okay, all right, well, let's see where this one goes. And by the time that I'd finished with it, I thought, I've got an episode there.
Yeah, definitely. Do you find it quite discouraging though, the amount of conflict there is and the kind of the language that's used to portray the disagreements online, especially with the anonymity of the internet and you're behind a keyboard, you've got no repercussions? I find, and it comes from both sides, atheists and the fundamentalist religious, is just so inhuman the way they treat each other and the way they treat someone who has a different idea to them. Do you find that at all disheartening, I suppose, for our species?
That's a great question. It feels systemic. You do not seem to get that way of that demeanor of interaction really seems to thrive on the internet in a way that it really doesn't when you've got people face to face with each other. And I think that probably says something about the system that, or
I think it shows quite a lot about the psychology of humans as well, because you take away that face-to-face humanity involved, and it's almost like you're just talking to an object and you can treat them however you like without thinking that there is a person with emotions and feelings and struggles behind that monitor.
It definitely starts to fall towards that. It definitely starts to lean into that. Yeah. I think the problem that we've got is that people don't tend to want to understand a steel man of the other person's position. People seem to be very happy to jump to conclusions about what the person they're arguing with thinks, and that seems to be a road to disaster.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? You're attacking a belief based on what you assume it must be, right, without understanding the full context of where they're coming from, how they got that information, what level of evidence they have to support it, and their background and all that sort. There's so many things that are involved with a system of belief, and it's not just if I say I'm theist, that must mean I'm religious, so I believe in God, I read the Bible. I mean, it does believe in God, I suppose, by definition, but that I read the Bible and that I go to church every day. And that's kind of the picture you draw up immediately when someone says they're a theist.
Yeah.
For me personally, I don't know how I'd define. I usually define myself as agnostic, because it so much depends on the definition of atheist and theist. There's so many different definitions people use, but everyone comes with baggage. Even the word God. You say God, and immediately you're given an image in your mind of what that must mean.
Yeah.
And people mean so many different things with that. It's the same as to say, with if someone says they believe in something, you immediately have that picture and you jump to conclusions, and therefore it must be attacked because it disagrees with mine.
Yes.
In my own mind.
Yeah. I think that it's a sort of modern form of heresy that people have sacred values. So those sacred values might be something like, I believe that science has to explain everything because science has explained so much. So I'm going to turn to the scientists and I'm sort of going to conflate the principles of science with the scientific institution. Yeah. And then it's a slippery slope from there, really.
See, that's a bit of a difficult one as well, saying that there's a distinction between science and anything else, because the way I see science isn't it's not a thing. It's not something that you refer back to. It's a definition of human discovery, and so it's by that definition, yes, science will explain everything, but not in the form that it currently takes.
So
not in the form of materialism. And people confuse. They seem to conflate or define science as materialism, whereas materialism is a philosophy.
Yeah.
It's a story that we've developed from information gathered by the processes within science.
Right.
That doesn't mean that, when we say science will discover everything, if we use science as the definition of human discovery, it will, because everything by definition must be discovered by human discovery. And it's just the processes within science and the methods within science that determine how we get there. And I think materialism at the moment is not capable of explaining all the phenomena that we've seen so far, or at least more recently.
Well, I mean, I completely agree with you. If I may, I'd like to just come back to the science point. The way that I personally understand and sort of define science is in that scientific method. It engenders the ideas of controlling variables, trying to test one thing at a time, trying to get replication, trying to get peer review. There's a lot of different aspects to it, but it's the best method that we've found so far of trying to look into the world and determine what's objectively true.
Would you define that method specifically as science then, or would you say that method is an aspect of science? Because if that method, say, is updated to encompass new ideas, would that then no longer be science?
It depends on if you're following the method, really. If you're trying to find out what's objectively true by doing controlled experiments and you're working with other people who are trying to replicate those same things, then I would say that's the neatest definition of science that I can come up with in my mind. However, there are problems with that definition, for example. So my tantric experience is quasi-scientific, because I've been able to implement some of those values in my own personal subjective experience of it, However, I haven't been able to replicate that. I haven't been able to find other people who've had tantric experiences and then come up with tests and work through those. It would probably be quite difficult. I would probably need funding. It's not straightforward for your average person to start doing science, but they can do a sort of quasi-science. They can take a very methodical approach to trying to understand whether something is real or not. Let me give you an example of where I try and demark these things. I've had a lot of telepathic experiences, and some of them have been really fabulous. And I don't tell people that I think that telepathy is definitely real because of my own experiences, but I sort of do that with Tantra. But just for me, I'm not saying that because I've had this story that you have to believe that Tantra is true. What I say is that because I've had this experience, I'd like you to accept that I've had my own convincing evidence of it. And that's where because I know that previously, like 28-year-old Matthew hearing the Tantra thing would have been interested. It would have gone on the back burner, but he wouldn't have found my story persuasive. He would start believing in it just because I'd said it.
No. And as you say, you shouldn't, based on one account. Yeah. And that gets into the difficulty of the definition of what is anecdotal evidence and when is it appropriate for use as evidence and when is it not.
Right.
Because I always go back to near-death experiences on these because that's my kind of what I've looked at most. Yeah. And by definition, an anecdotal data is a small number of people, one person or a small number of people have had this experience, and therefore that should be evidence that it's the same for everybody. And people say that near-death experiences fall into that category, whereas I would say they don't at this point, because A, of the sheer number of them, and B, of the fact that many of them have been third-party verified. I think as soon as you've got that level of verification, that takes it out of the realm of anecdotal into case studies, I suppose.
This is the difference between where we go from anecdotal to veridical, right? Where people who've had these NDEs report information that they shouldn't have been able to have access to. It sort of supports the idea that they had some sort of awareness while their brain was off. They're incredibly compelling. I can tell you the reason why I didn't pursue those. I've been thinking about this. The reason that I didn't pursue those too aggressively on my channel, for me personally, was because it seems to come down to a science versus science issue. And I felt that it was the point where I wanted to convince as many... Okay, so I know that I'm dancing from thought to thought here, so sorry about that. But I wanted to convince as many skeptics as possible as to what my logic and rationality was. And I started to see that the near-death experience route, they had the same sorts of reasons as to why they didn't accept the evidence. And I thought, well, I'm either going to have to become an absolute expert in the evidence, which I think is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, right? If you can say, well, right, there are these many studies that were done, these many veridical experiences vetted by qualified doctors, and you can dig into the detail, then that's great. I developed a different strategy than that, but I think that going through that NDE route is valid. But I'm just reminding myself now of the question. So we've got this: where do we go from anecdotal to data?
Yes. Or when do we move from anecdotal evidence to something of more evidential value than is claimed by anecdotal data?
I think that's probably going to be something like a formal study. So Sampania with his aware studies, those are pretty interesting. Those are pretty good. In a certain sense, if you really wanted to be really thorough about this, it feels like we should always be conducting a study, that there should always be an ear to the ground for these things to try and catch verified experiences wherever they happen, whenever. I'm disappointed in a sense, unless people have got some real solid rebuttals as to what's going on in these cases, as to why we haven't stepped it up to that grade of investigation yet. But I need to understand better from people who are skeptical as to why that hasn't happened yet.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the Sampania studies certainly are very interesting. We don't know the result of Aware 2 as of yet, but we know that the first Aware didn't receive any hits on the target. And the reason for that, I always get these numbers mixed up. I think it was either 4,000 or 12,000 people were involved. Let's say 4,000 just to be safe. Out of those 4,000, I think a very, very, very small number, single digits of numbers of people had any kind of out-of-body experience with perception. Mm-hmm. And out of those people, one was well enough to be interviewed later on. All the others either died or were just too ill to be interviewed at the time. So out of that 4,000 or 12,000 people, we had one case that was studyable, I suppose. And although they didn't see the target, they did have veridical perception, in the sense that they heard things that were being discussed. They were able to identify one of the doctors during cardiac arrests. And, even that in itself is decent evidence. But because it didn't follow the method and see the specific target, it's often discarded as it's a failed experiment in that case.
Yeah. And I think that to me seems to suggest that maybe the experimental design needs to be more flexible to incorporate that sort of data from the get-go, and it needs to be verified by the skeptics, because I do think that having that skeptical response is important and valid. However, I haven't come across a skeptical rebuttal to these sorts of evidence that I've personally found convincing that makes me believe it's all just a strange concoction of our minds. I mean, that in a sense, that seems like gaslighting, really.
I think the problem is, because near-death experiences are so, I suppose, trendy at this current moment in time, the skeptics that jump on it are your bloggers, your people that make a living out of being skeptical. And there's very few professional individuals who are skeptical but do look. I mean, Sampania is skeptical with this sort of thing. Yeah. He won't divulge his beliefs because, of course, I suppose being in that kind of area, you've got to be careful when dealing with this sort of thing. But, I mean, you have folks like Dr. Gerald Verley, who's a Dutch anaesthesiologist, who's do you know much about the Pam Reynolds case?
I'm afraid I don't.
No, I won't give details, but effectively that's probably one of the strongest cases of veridical perception. And he's gone against that and given information as to why he believes it's not paranormal, I suppose, for want of a better word. Unfortunately, his information has been very, very widely rebutted by not only the researchers of the case, but also the doctors and the surgeons that were involved directly with it. For instance, I know a guy who received email communication with a guy called Dr. Spetzler, who is Pam Reynolds' head surgeon. And effectively, Dr. Verley was saying that, her brain wasn't flat, she wasn't under the procedure at the time, so she was able to. And the doctor was coming back and saying, no, that's not true, effectively. He didn't say that, but he was just giving details of the case. And from the details he gave, he said there is absolutely no way she was conscious during that time. It's medically impossible. And so, some of the explanations that Dr. Verley gives are very widely contended. And I think he's probably the most prominent skeptic of the near-death experience, or at least that specific case. But I've very seldom seen any near-death experience skeptic who seem to really consider the veridical aspect. They all, the majority of them but they go for the subjective experiences. I saw the white light, I saw my dead relative, things that aren't objectively verifiable.
Right, I've seen Neil deGrasse Tyson doing that.
He's an astrophysicist.
But he says stuff on it, though. He pipes up, I've got something to say about this. Oh, okay.
If he's looked at the data and he's really dug into it, I'll take his opinion seriously. But as from what I'm aware, he's never touched it. So he's coming to his conclusions based on his common sense from what he's seen of science, which is astrophysics, which is very little to do with human psychology and biology and whatever. There's a guy called Kevin Nelson, who's a neurochemist, who's written a book about the spiritual area of the brain, and it effectively believes that it's all in the brain. But when pushed, he says he comes up with all these explanations which are very plausible for some of the experiences of near-death experiences. But when we say, what about veridical aspects? I believe he's openly said, I'm not going there, and I'm not taking them into consideration. So you're focusing on explaining what's possible. I mean, even the explanations that they give for some of these other things are don't work. I mean, one, for example, Susan Blackmore says about the tunnel that it's caused by retina damage as the brain receives less and less oxygen. The retina slowly starts dying from the peripheral area in which creates that tunnel vision. Problem is, people aren't describing tunnel vision; they're describing a three-dimensional tunnel, an actual tunnel, not a shortening of vision. And it seems just to be very, very literature ignorant explanations, I suppose. I'll give you one more example as well, which I found funny, from Doctor. Is it Doctor? I can't remember if he's a doctor, but Stefan A. Schwartz. I believe he is a doctor. Very big into remote viewing. When I say very big, he's done studies and experiments on this for years. And he was saying about Daniel Dennett, who, when they were talking about near-death experience, I think he was talking about near-death experiences or psi phenomena. Yeah. Regardless, he was saying, Daniel Dennett was saying, well, it's all an illusion, it's all in the brain, etc. The standard. And when Dr. Schwartz pressed him, well, have you read the detailed literature on this? Have you read all the cases and everything? And apparently Dennett said, what, you think I'd waste my time reading all that sort of stuff? No, of course I haven't read the literature. And unfortunately that shows, a person who's very well revered in the skeptical movement. It shows you what kind of thing you're dealing with.
Have you looked through the telescope? Have you looked through the telescope to see the craters on the moon?
Galileo's telescope. Yes, indeed. So it's a battle to try and get people even to look at the literature seriously before coming to conclusions. Yes.
Well, this is partly why. Well, it's not partly why. I mean, it's the reason why I'm pursuing a different parallel direction, right? I've got this different strategy that I'm using, and I feel like one of the things that I'm learning about the strategy that I'm using is that it's not easy for people to instantly understand why it should work. And that creates this strange scenario for me, because I feel like it's built on the, as all philosophy does, it sort of stands on the shoulders of giants. The strategy that I use is inspired by the thinking of David Chalmers, who's a well-known, very well-respected philosopher. He posits the hard problem of consciousness, which I'm no doubt you and many of your viewers are familiar with. He also...
the brick wall that everyone has to face.
Well, yeah. And he also goes a step further and talks about the meta problem of consciousness. Why are we talking about consciousness? And you will see this in the interviews that I have with people who are skeptical, because this will be this is the kryptonite for, if I'm tackling Superman, right? It's maybe I should be Superman. I don't know. Whichever way around it is, doesn't matter. Am I the bad guy? So what I've got is the meta problem. Why is it that we're talking about consciousness? Can we say that the fact that we talk about consciousness is reducible to physical and mathematical law, or is it reducible to consciousness? And if it's reducible to consciousness, then we've got consciousness as something that stands aside from, separate from anything that we could conceive of mathematical or physical law. And then we've got this really serious problem. As soon as you accept that mind affects matter, we've got this whole amazing, interesting world of science that could come about and could grow out of that, trying to understand what the hell that means. But we don't seem to be ready for that stage yet.
No, but I think, as I think we said in your interview for your channel, it's widely accepted already, even though people don't realise it. It's widely accepted that mind has effect over matter, or that consciousness has effect over matter, because in the placebo effect, for instance, we know that that's the case. And that's based purely, that affects our physical wellness based purely on our expectation and our intention that what we've received is going to be working for us. I
feel like materialists and people who want to squash things down into a materialist ideology will respond to that by saying it's because your brain releases stress reduction hormones and different chemicals which reduce inflammation, and they do this, and they won't agree that the...
But even with that, fine. But what has caused that release of chemicals, of hormones, whatever? It's, the core... Even if that's the case, it's still the intention that has caused that reaction to take place. Still the belief that's caused that reaction to take place.
A materialist, though, will reduce that intention into atoms bouncing around according to the laws of physics. They'll reduce it all the way down to that, and they'll say that our experience of consciousness is sort of a product of these mathematical and physical laws. That's the claim. So what I'm trying to do is call them on the cognitive dissonance. What I'm trying to do is say, look, it's all very well you thinking that physics is making you go around and say the things that you do, but if physics is the thing that's responsible for you saying that it feels like something to be you, then it can't be you saying that. It has to be physics. And that's where you've got your problem, because I don't imagine any reasonably any reasonable person who's not entrenched or surrounded by scientific materialism, anyone who's sort of like hasn't gone too hard down that particular route is going to say, you've got to be kidding me. Of course I'm in control of my actions. I don't know how much control I've got over my actions, but when I tell you that it feels like something to be me, it's because it really does. And I can really say that.
Sure. And it always, as we say, always comes down to that hard problem. Regardless of what your belief is, how, if you are a materialist, how does conscious or non-conscious matter, which is all fundamentally non-conscious, generate any form of experience? And outside of that, we've got, and that's why I say the belief that the brain does not create consciousness is equally as supported by the evidence as the belief that the brain does create consciousness, because you can use both. You can use the evidence and the correlations to argue both of which have no mechanism or understanding, but both of which are equally therefore as plausible. And the thing is, I'm not entirely convinced that the brain does not create consciousness, because from the evidence I've seen, you could equally argue that the brain does create consciousness, but the mind, but that consciousness and individuality remains after the death of the brain. So it could be that it produces it, and then it's there after the brain dies, because the evidence from near-death phenomena, terminal lucidity, and all that kind of area doesn't necessarily directly suggest that the brain does not create consciousness, but it does suggest that it continues after the brain is no longer functioning. You could posit from there, does the brain create it and then it's kind of this individual thing on its own, or does the brain not create it and it's always been there, which I think is more likely the case. But you could argue either, that's just my personal opinion. From terminal lucidity, for instance, we know that the brain is dying but consciousness remains intact, it seems, or at least is. So with terminal lucidity, for those that don't know, those who are in serious brain degenerative situations like Alzheimer's or various other issues, for years or months even, they could be completely elucid and completely confused and completely unknowing of where they are or who's around them. Sometimes within days, months, sometimes within hours, sometimes within minutes of their physical death, they become suddenly completely lucid. And my argument is, well, if the brain does even initially create consciousness, that doesn't seem to work, considering the brain is completely degenerated when the lucidity returns. What you could argue is that the consciousness was created as the brain was operating, but then as the brain was finally dying, it was separating somehow. We still can't say what the initial causation of that consciousness was, only we can say that it's still around while the brain isn't working.
Can I play devil's advocate with you? Would that be all right? So I feel like what we're suggesting in this particular model, and it's the reason why I fail to... I find it a lot more... I think you're more generous to it than I am. And the reason for that is that let's get it clear what we're suggesting. So within such a model, we've got this material world, and we're not necessarily saying that we understand what it is, or that we are saying that it is purely material, that it completely reduces down to matter. We're not saying that. So we're not adopting a definition of materialism, but we're saying that we've got this. Well, I don't know if we're saying the matter's unconscious.
We're just saying that, you know, material might not be the only aspect of reality, but in this model, somehow with a mechanism we don't understand yet, the brain does generate consciousness.
So
to begin with.
I wasn't conscious before, but we arranged what could be food, right? Like some potatoes, some chicken, and some mushy peas, for example. And we broke those down chemically, and we rearranged those into just the right patterns, and that created this feeling like something it created a ghost in the machine, right?
Yeah, effectively.
And then the ghost is free after the machine's gone.
Yes, or once that consciousness or that initial consciousness is created, it's no longer, I suppose, bound to that. Or it's no longer dependent on that matter being in that same coordination, same orientation, I suppose.
You see, what I like about what I like about this idea is that it does account for the fact that it feels like something to be us, and the fact that we can talk about it. But I'm much less comfortable in spontaneously creating ghosts in the machine than I am to say, well, I guess the machine must be in a ghost. Flip it the other way around.
This is why I say in this model we're assuming that this is the case, that we don't understand the mechanism behind it, but we're assuming that it does take place.
I think it's generous of you to be open to that way of thinking, and I don't mean that in any sort of. I'm not
saying I agree with that. I'm just saying that in this model we have to assume.
Right, but you're taking it seriously, and I do respect that. Although I can't quite get on board with it as much myself, but I would be open to people making arguments for it. I would. I
mean, you see, for me, because I can see that, you know, that's just as plausible to say that as it is to say that consciousness is an independent thing, because both are equally don't have a mechanism. You know, we don't have a mechanism for how unconscious matter could generate consciousness, but equally we don't have a mechanism as to how consciousness could exist with, you know, independently. So both are equally supported in my mind. I'm very much lured and persuaded by the philosophical approach to science that we can reduce everything down into elements or processes, right? So we try to explain the world by positing fundamental building blocks. Right. So this is what Deepak Chopra would call ontological primitives, right? What are the raw elements that you build your world out of? And in our quest for science, or a quest of science, not force, well, little column A, little column B. They both mean the same, really.
Yeah, sure. So the beautiful story that we have for that now is something like quantum fields or something like fundamental particles, but the thing that I like about materialism, even though I think it's intellectually done, you know, I do think that consciousness kills it as an idea. It's just not tenable after that. But the thing that I like about that approach is that there is this effort to say we can build up what we see from these individual parts. And I really like that approach. And I find that this idea that things pop into existence instead of... I find the idea that things popping into existence just feels like we're going in the wrong direction from a scientific approach that's worked really well, even though it hasn't got everything right. And I don't want to throw away reductionism. My argument or my counter is to say, let's carry on doing reductionism, but let's do reductionism with an acknowledgement of what consciousness is. Let's be sensible about it. Let's accept the fact that mind affects matter. And then I think something like Idealism by Bernardo Kastrup, where you posit that there is a mind behind the cosmos, and then you explain individual minds by them being a dissociation of that. That seems reductionistically very... It's there's a lot of harmony to it. It makes a lot of sense, and it seems to conserve our ideals of trying to reduce things. And look, I realise it is actually very important, and you do a wonderful job of this. It is really important to be really open to a lot of people saying different things. But the whole emergence thing, I've just never found it very persuasive. In terms of strong emergence, I think that weak emergence works. I think that if you rearrange things that already exist into a new form, that creates a new experience or a new thing. So you could say, water and cold, snowflakes. Snowflakes are emergent. That's great. But we built it out of the stuff that we had.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I always found emergence to be the obvious answer. But I only did that before I really started thinking about why I believe that. And when I started thinking about why I believe that, I started thinking, how? how would that possibly work? And then, as I say, I started getting into this after the Depression, and I started getting into this. I started looking at some of the evidence that goes against that. And you start to really think, yeah, we're taught these things as facts, but we don't realise that they're assumptions. They're one story created by the data, but they're not the be-all and end-all story of it, and that story is the philosophy of materialism or whatever else.
It's sort of enmeshed with that. If it isn't materialism itself, I find this scientific worldview incredibly seductive and beautiful, and I find, I mean, there are things that are gaps in my knowledge. For example, so negative charge repels negative charge. So why exactly do electrons like to hang around in pairs in chemical elements? I mean, I don't get that. But there'll be some obscure sort of physics that'll explain it to me, I assume. I take it as a promissory thing. But the whole idea that we can go from the lowest levels of physics up through chemistry, and we can understand it as physics, and then we can take chemistry, build it to biology, and understand it as chemistry. That's extraordinary, and it seems to work for a lot of things.
I wonder, what's your thought on the theory of origin of life, things like abiogenesis, life from non-life, and things like that? Right.
So this is a real good one. I don't generally get.
Oh yeah, because you did Bob, didn't you?
Thanks. Yes, yeah. Bob. Right. So Bob is an example. Bob was a direct refutation against an episode that Kurzgesagt put out about consciousness, where they asserted that consciousness comes about for goal-seeking behavior. So I went, oh yeah, really? Okay, well, I'll program goal-seeking behavior, and then I've created consciousness. Why? And then I sort of explored why that was not really a coherent idea in the episode. And that's consciousness critiqued on Consciousness Matters. But, that's the thumbnail for it. I think the actual title for it is a little bit more complicated, but it's findable. What does Bob tell us? Abiogenesis. Bob didn't really get into abiogenesis. Bob was more about the direct refutation of an assertion of Kurzgesagt, because this is really insidious to me, because you have channels that are well known for being scientifically accurate, putting out opinion pieces on materialism as if it was just a part of science. It's not. That's really concerning, but abiogenesis. Let me try and think on this. Oh, you know what? This is one of the biggest problems. So in philosophy, what you tend to do is you swap a terrible problem for a better problem, right?
A slightly less terrible problem.
That's it. Yeah. So the hard problem of consciousness, rubbish. Okay. Let's swap it in idealism for the dissociation problem. What is it that creates dissociated forms of consciousness, or what we might call life? That's a good one. It seems more plausible, though, for us to imagine that there is a giant mind that bubbles off, and then the bubble comes back to the mind, than there is for there being complete nothingness and a bubble just going, boop. Where did the bubble come from? Nowhere. I mean, I don't know how you process that, but it's still a problem. Dissociation is still a problem, but it's a more tractable problem. But I don't really know how much I can say on it that's going to be helpful. My position on it.
Well, I mean, just to say now, on the 7th, by the time this video goes out, it'll already be done. But on the 7th, we've got Bernardo coming into the Discord, so hopefully you'll come along to that and ask him some questions. Sure,
I will. I will work on some questions. Yes,
because he is the biggest mind on idealism at the moment. He knows. I mean, I struggle big time to understand the position, but he knows very much what he's talking about. Very clever guy, very convincing, very good arguments. So he's one to look up. Anyone watching Bernardo Kastrup, Dr. Bernardo Kastrup.
Definitely.
But yeah, looking forward to having him in for some questions.
Fantastic.
Okay, so I suppose to finish off, we've covered quite a bit. I suppose to finish off, where do you see your channel Consciousness Matters going from here?
I know what I'd love to do. I know I have aspirations. I would love to have a conversation with Richard Dawkins if anyone would let me. I'm trying to see who I think I am when I say things like that, and I feel like I'm being cocky or something. But no, I've spent. Right. Okay. Let me just lay it out like this. I know that I have the sort of mind that is optimized towards doing things like software coding, right? That's what I do as a profession. So being methodical, being very logical, that matters an awful lot to me. I've spent 5 years emotionally and mentally going through a bunch of different positions, going through spiritual worldviews, feeling particular ways, being persuaded by evidence, and then sort of like being tugged back and having to incorporate skeptical points of view. And what I really want to do with Consciousness Matters is I want to take on the biggest fish I possibly can. And I want to have good natured, good faith conversations about these sorts of areas. Now, I think that what's going to happen is that a lot of people are going to be exposed to having quasi-religious like beliefs in the modern age, and will go, oh, right, well, that doesn't actually make very much sense. And Matthew's kind of pointed that out, but I could be wrong. So it's my own journey of discovery as well. And I might end up changing my position.
You say you were working on a flow chart on how to argue certain points?
Yes.
Did you want to go through that quickly and see what that says?
That would be wonderful, yes. So I've tried to reduce all of the arguments I usually make and my strategy for having debates into a simple flow chart. The reason for this is to be as transparent as possible to everybody else about what I'm doing so they can critique it. So I'm not relying on any sort of stealth or anything like that. I'm saying, look, this is my argument. You go out there and you see what you can do with it. So it all focuses around what we've already talked about. This, does it feel like something to be you? And whoever is doing the flowchart now gets set with a bunch of answers. So one of the first criticisms I've had is, well, you seem to be able to pick choices that don't make sense. And my response to that is always, they're there for a reason. Don't worry about the fact they don't make sense. Just pick the one that does make sense. It's fine. So, well, yeah, okay. So let's play along with it. Does it feel like something to be you?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. So are you able to explain that to other people?
Yeah.
Brilliant. So would you accept that the mind shapes matter?
Yes.
Brilliant.
So.
Very straightforward. So we've gone to the point now where we have to say, is mind more likely emergent or fundamental?
I'd probably add one there that says unsure and put it to agnosticism.
That's great. No, that's, you know what, that's absolutely fine. And I like that. However, I don't feel that there's any problem with feeling like you can't answer whether it's emergent or fundamental and just letting it rest there in the flowchart. But yeah, no, that's to say that to say that one is unsure there is nothing wrong with that. That is perfectly fine. I've got my own reasons for believing predominantly in the fundamental view. However, I'm always interested to see what people have to say about the emergent view. Yeah,
it's difficult for me to answer that because I think the evidence is supportive of both, and it just depends which one you like more. Because as I say, it could very well be that the mind is emergent but then is non-dependent, or it could just as equally be as likely that it's fundamental and works through the physical brain.
Maybe you'd like to work with me on an episode about it in the future at some point.
Sure, absolutely, I'd love to.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've gone through a fairly straightforward route to get to the answer. So I suppose we understand the route that we've taken, but we don't understand why there's all this other stuff in the flowchart. What's necessary? Why is that necessary? What's that trying to do? So I'll just give you a little talk.
From your first box there, sorry, what's mind and physics? What do they
Right.
mean?
Right. So.
And no one.
Brilliant. Okay, let's do that. So these are for the second iterations of the loop. So you can say, does it feel like something to be you? You can answer yes. You can also answer no, and I just dump you straight into illusionism if that's the case. And that's correct, right? I'm not just trying to dump you as such. I'm saying that's where the philosophy now takes you. This is where you've got to. But if we say, yes, it feels like something to be you. Yeah, that's fine. It does. So this flowchart should trap Sean Carroll. That's what it's been designed to do. Anyone who's a materialist is going to have a very hard problem with this flowchart, because what they'll say is, yeah, it feels like something to be me. Yeah, I can explain that to other people. No, mind does not shape matter. That is silly. No, of course that can't be the case. So I say no, and then it goes back to then who or what answers the next question.
Oh, I see.
So then they either have to say, well, mind does, and they've just contradicted themselves, or they go, physics. Yes, I'm a physicalist. Physics is the thing that causes me to say that it feels like something to be me, to be me, right?
Yeah, I've just followed it. I'm just seeing the last conclusion. It just made me laugh.
Yeah, get it. So I say, are you physics? And they go, yes or no. You know, I'm giving them a little time to think this one through as to whether they really wanted to pick that option. Are you physics? So they might say, they might go, yeah, maybe I picked wrong at this point, and they say no, and then who or what answers the next question. This is really, I like this actually, because the more I think about this flowchart, the more it is really seeking I. It's making you focus on what the I thing is.
What I is, yeah.
So you can answer physics. Let's say you don't chicken out and you go, yes, I am physics. We're going to do the double down on this. And it says, well, did you create the universe? Like if you're physics, if you're responsible for the expression of physical law, well, did you create the universe? Because it sounds like that's what you're telling me, if that's the case.
Well, could they not argue that, well, no, because the laws of physics came about after as a result of the creation of the universe, and that something was there to create the universe before that?
Well, I think that they're digging themselves a deeper hole if they do. It's not solving any problems for them. It's making bigger problems for them. So you could, so you can set that back. You can say, are you physics, or are you the thing that's responsible for physics? It's gonna play out in much the same way. If they say that they are, then they're saying that they created the universe. And, you know, the conclusion. Yeah, quite.
Yeah. I think that'll. If it doesn't succeed in changing people's mind, it'll at least make them really think about what they're arguing.
Yeah, I hope so. Feel free to use it when you interview people.
That'd be great. I might do that because it is interesting. It does follow kind of with even the title of my my project, doesn't it? Because it's asking, well, who the hell are you actually?
Yeah, it's like the best question to ask. I think. I think the only thing that I would critique about my own flowchart is that people are uncomfortable with me saying that emergence dictates atheism and the consciousness being fundamental dictates theism. I haven't justified those leaps. I believe I can justify those leaps, otherwise they wouldn't be there, but they're not in the flowchart itself. Sorry, yeah, carry on.
Okay, great. Okay, we'll I think we've covered everything there then. Just wanted to add that in at the end, because I remember last time we didn't actually get around to it, and we said we would.
Right.
In your interview, so just glad we can get there now.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for coming on, Matthew.
Been a pleasure.
Matthew, and you're not Matt. I appreciate it.
Likewise.
And, all the best for your channel, and make sure you go over and have a look at Matthew's channel, Consciousness Matters. I'll put a link to all of it in the description, and hopefully we'll work together again in the future.
I look forward to
several times. I think I'm due to interview Chris French. You're going to possibly come along and co-host that, aren't you?
I would absolutely love to. It would be an honour, Darren.
That'd be great. That'd be perfect.